Morning. Wow, thanks for that humbling intro. I think that's the first time in my life I've ever been called nice. That's not a common thing. So this morning, as a slow warm-up, I want to talk a little bit about experimentation culture at Booking. I think if you say if I built that culture, you're giving me a little bit too much credit. I joined Booking because that culture was already there, but I have spent the last 5 or 6 years trying to foster that culture and help it scale. The lights is fascinating. So my twin girls, they are not called A and B. That was a joke my wife did not appreciate. Funny story, actually. Let me take 1 minute of my time. When I suggested that, she got really upset, and then we went to the hospital to take echo. And apparently, in medical terms, when these doctors talk to each other, they also have to have some way to designate the twins. And because the twins don't have names yet, the common nomenclature inside the hospital is to call them A and B. And so we were in the hospital, and this woman is doing the echoscopy thing, and she says, well, it looks like B here is a little bit smaller than A. And my wife goes, what? So I'm like, no, I didn't say. She looks at me like I did something. So it ends up that Sophie is indeed a little bit smaller than Matilda. So I help, and my tagline on Twitter also is I help thousands of people run experiments to make Booking.com better. And I think one of the important things about my role, and I was talking to Else about this yesterday as well, is that I don't consider the people at Booking.com, the people who build product, to be my customer. My real customer are the people who use Booking.com products, and the role of the technology that I build and the culture that I try to encourage is to help those people internally, the people of Booking, to make Booking.com better. And I think it's important that all of us, when we're in this space of experimentation and CRO, we realize that our true customers are the people who use the products. They're not the clients that we are working with. They might feel like they're your customer because you're talking to them day to day, but the end objective of all of this is to make the products better. And that also means that you should be willing to say no in some cases if you think that what your immediate client is asking is not in favor of your customer, which is what our culture trying to create in Booking. Booking hardly requires an introduction. I think in this audience, I have this slide because some people have never heard of Booking. But I think here I'm kind of safe. We were founded in 1996. It's a Dutch company, actually. And it's one of the biggest platforms, or maybe even the biggest platforms for booking accommodations online. And I think testing is very deeply ingrained in the culture. So we wrote this paper about 3 years ago where we wanted to talk about the infrastructure that we're using to do this. So the infrastructure is very similar to like VWO or Split or Optimizely, but specifically for Booking.com. And the reason that we built this ourselves is that we started doing this 14 years ago, and there was nothing that we could buy off of the shelf. So we were really forced to build this from scratch. And by now, this is so ingrained into our technical infrastructure that it really wouldn't make sense for us to move to some third party. So we wrote this paper about some of the features that we think are specific to our stack. But today I want to talk about one very small aspect of this paper, and I think the thing that's actually most important about this whole paper, and that's the last sentence of the first paragraph of the abstract, which is that all of the stuff that we've built and all the work that I've done is very specific to the Booking.com culture, that this is intended to support something that's there and to foster something that's there. This is not pushed on top of an organization. You take an organization that already has this mindset and you try to encourage it further. And so this talk is a story about culture. Now, I made this slide, and I realized I have no idea what that means. I mean, like, how do I even show you culture? Right? We can talk about having an experimentation-driven organization. We can talk about having a testing culture. But what does that actually mean? How do I see culture? And after sleeping on that for a while, I realized that the way that people perceive culture, the way that we can see it, and the way they can show it to you is through the interaction that we have between people. Because culture is something that happens when people interact. And so ultimately, this is a story about the people of Booking.com. Now, I'm a data scientist at heart, and so when I want to tell you a story, I want to tell you a story with data, but I don't just want to show you the data. A good scientist and a good paper will always start by explaining you the method by which this data was required. And if you take anything from this talk, then I hope that you remember that whenever someone shows you data, the first question you should ask is, where does that data come from? Because data by its very nature is not objective. It is subjective. Someone decided what data to collect, how to store it. And all these things are important decisions that determine how useful that data is to you. So I'm going to show you my exact method for the data that is part of this talk. And so my method was the following. I have to sample some population, and I have to survey them, and I have to show you the results. So my sample was, I went to our PR department, and I asked them, do you have any pretty photos of employees? Because I wanted to make this slide, right? This slide was the one I wanted to make, and I realized I would need pictures of people. And if this was any normal company, then I would go to the A/B testing team and take pictures of the people in the A/B testing team. But at Booking, the most difficult step of finding pictures of people who run experiments is the picture part, because everyone runs experiments. And so I went to the PR department and said, hey, do you have some pretty pictures? I filtered out the people who don't run experiments, and then I selected 6 at random and sent them an email saying, hey, how to use experimentation as part of your job. And then I waited for the replies to come in. All 6 of them replied. I copy-pasted their responses on the slides, and that's my talk. So in terms of raw data, it doesn't get much rawer than this, right? This is raw culture that you're going to get. This is not tweaked by me in any way. I'm not trying to summarize this for you. I'm going to give you some context around it to help you understand what these people are saying. But all in all, this is the culture that is ingrained at Booking.com. Now, one thing that I noticed when the replies started coming in is that there's one word or one concept that comes back a lot. And it's kind of nice to see this because it ties very clearly into the mission statement of Booking.com, which is to empower people to experience the world, right? We are not just an accommodation booking platform. We want people to go out there and experience what it's like to be outside of their own homes. And when you look at this, then this one word, this verb, empower, is also something that comes back in a lot of the responses from people when they talk about experimentation. So if you take Clyde here, he's one of our client-side developers. He says data-driven is quite common these days in tech. However, empowering everyone to make data-driven decisions independently is quite unique. And this, to me, is such an important aspect of the way that Booking works. We are not using these experiments, or we're not using this data as a way to push down things that management wants to do, or push down control on top of an organization. We're using it as tools for the people on the ground to actually make independent decisions. And so we are giving the people who are building Booking.com the tools to make those decisions by themselves, and we're using that tooling to make visible how those decisions are being made. Nakia, who's one of our copywriters, says something similar. She says, well, I kind of come up with an idea of a breakfast, bike to the office, and have it live well before lunch. So this is something about agile environment, right? Being able to execute very quickly. I've never worked anywhere else that gives me this level of ownership and creative freedom to validate my ideas. And so again, this idea of empowerment or of ownership is very strongly tied for these people to being able to experiment. The other thing I find interesting about Nakia is that she says creative freedom. And something I hear people say when they talk about A/B testing is, well, this is limiting my creative freedom because now I have to listen to the data. And this is, to me, such a weird concept that you would consider validation to be limiting to your creativity, right? Creativity is not about being able to do what you want. Right? Creativity is about trying to explore what it is that actually helps customers. And so for Nakia, and I agree with this, experimentation is helping you be more creative and not less. Lastly, the person who mentioned the empowerment was Heloisa, who at that point was very new to Booking. She's one of our client-side developers, and she said there's no higher valued opinions, no centralization of decision-making. Now, what's ironic to me is that this idea of no centralized decision-making, people being able to make decisions themselves independently, that is actually enabled by having a centralized platform that allows people to run experiments, right? The infrastructure that we have that allows everyone to run experiments is the same infrastructure that allows people to then independently make those decisions. The reason we allow those people to make decisions is because we trust that the data that they use is valid and that the decisions are visible to others because the platform is in place. Now, all of these, to me, boil down to a very simple truth. Is that you cannot have a democracy without empowering the people. If you truly want to be a data-driven organization, if you truly want to democratize experimentation and roll it out across all the organization, you have to do the same thing with decision-making. You cannot give people the tools to run experiments, but not the ownership and accountability to make decisions. These two things are sides of a coin. And trying to make a company data-driven without relinquishing power to people on the ground is not going to work. Hadir said something very interesting. She said, experimentation is a great way to figure out if something as small as a copy change or something as big as a whole book process flow will help users, but you can't depend on it as your only source of product validation. And I think this ties into Ton's talk, even though I didn't see Ton's talk. But I hear people talk about that, and he talks about other forms of validation, and I wholeheartedly agree with this. But this also ties into things that Elsa is saying about user research. Right? This is not the only way that you learn about customers. It's a way to validate that the things that you're implementing are having the impact that you expect, but there's a whole bunch of things that have to happen around experimentation that you need to build a product. Now, this reminds me of this statement that I've seen people make at conferences quite a lot. Has anyone seen this before? No? Anyone? No? Good, because this is wrong for two reasons. So this comes up quite a lot at data mining conferences or data science conferences. The plural of anecdote is not data. And what people are trying to say is that you have a bunch of anecdotes that doesn't really prove anything. But this is wrong for two reasons, this statement. One is that that's not actually what the guy said. He said this, which is pretty much the opposite. Funny story, if you Google this, you will get more hits than when you Google this. So that shows you what Google knows. But the other thing is that this is also the only version of this statement that makes sense. The plural of anecdote is data. Actually, one anecdote is already data. Your collection of cat pictures on your thumb drive is also data, right? That's not the point. It's not data that we're after. Data is just data. To make decisions and to validate product ideas and to validate that we're having the right impact requires evidence. And evidence is slightly different from data. Quite often, evidence will take the form of data, but it doesn't have to. A rational argument can also be a form of evidence. Let me give you a sort of a practical example of how this changes our thinking about what A/B testing or what website optimization is about. So let's take this classic example. Okay, so you've never seen the plural of anecdote is not data quote, but have you seen people play this game where they ask you to raise your hand if A is better and raise your hand if B is better? Have you seen that? Yeah. It's stupid. No, I'm sorry, but so the reason it's stupid is it teaches us that we are terrible at guessing. And that's true. We are terrible at guessing. My point is that it's not guessing that we should be doing in the first place. Right? If your product development strategy relies on guessing, then good luck. Right? Well, and luck is what you need because you're guessing. So I call this the website optimization paradigm, where you have an A and you have a B, and you say, well, let's change the button from yellow to blue and see if it increases the magic number. And magic number can be conversion or average order value, whatever you want. And then we have a yellow button and a blue button, right? And now if I had to pick which one's going to win, I would basically be guessing. And my point is that we should not be guessing in the first place. What we should be doing is hypothesis testing. And this is a slightly different paradigm. And I'm going to go to the next slide. And I want you to look very carefully and see if you can notice the difference between this paradigm and the hypothesis testing paradigm. Yeah, you ready? OK, so this is website optimization. And here's what A and B would look like if you're hypothesis testing. So do you see the difference between A and B now? The point is A and B are exactly the same. A and B didn't change. The implementation is the same. What changed is my description of what's going on. So in this case, I'm saying, we observed in user research that some people have difficulty finding the Buy Now button. We suspect this is caused by the low contrast between the font and the background. And to solve this user issue, we will change the button from yellow to blue. If the solution works, we expect to see more users hover, click, and eventually purchase. Now, nothing about the actual implementation changed. Nothing about the technical infrastructure changed. We're going to run exactly the same experiment. But there's a very, very important distinction between the previous slide and this one. And that change and the difference is not something that we can see in the tooling. It's not something we can build, because that change only exists in your head. That change only exists in the things that you can now do, the things you can now reason about, that you could not do before. We are no longer guessing. We are now testing an idea, a conception of how this product is being used. And that allows us to do a few things. For example, imagine that I'm going to do multivariate testing, something that some companies are pushing. So I add a C. That's great. And my C is, I don't know, let's pick another color, light green. So I'm going to make A is the yellow button, B is the blue button, and C is the light green button. Now, if we are in this world, the website optimization world, then you have no way of knowing whether B or C is going to win, right? You're guessing, so both have about equal opportunity. But if we're in this world and I tell you that C is light green, you can reason about that and tell me I'm full of shit. Because why will light green not work? Contrast. It does not increase the contrast. I'm not even testing the idea I said I was testing in the first place. And this is an enormously powerful ability, because it allows us to have discussions about which variations we should be testing and which variations we should not be testing. Now, let me give you another example of how this slight change of the paradigm helps you run experiments in a different way. If this test actually works, let's take this one. If this test actually works, what will we do next? More guessing, right? We guess the next thing. Maybe we make other things blue. Maybe it was the blue that made it work. Maybe let's make the font blue now. I don't know. If we're in this world, what can I do? Find other places where contrast is low, right? So having a description, having a hypothesis, having some idea of what we're testing in the first place helps me reason about what I should be testing, how I should be testing, what I should be testing next. And it even helps me use the results of that test to then decide what to do next. And this is what at Booking we call evidence-based customer-centric product development. And that's a mouthful, I know, so let me untangle it. We're not necessarily data-driven, but we're evidence-based. We're using this data as evidence for an idea. We're customer-centric because that idea starts from what a user is looking for, what a customer wants from us. And we're using this to do product development because we're a business, we're not a scientific institute. And Finn, one of our product owners, put this very nicely. He says, we use experimentation to help us validate hypotheses with the goal of addressing well-defined user problems. We are not guessing here. We have a very clear intent and a very clear goal. We have identified something that we think is a point of friction for our users, and we want to improve that experience. And so we're running this experiment not as a guessing game, but as an attempt to solve a well-defined issue. Now, to help people do this, we created what we call the hypothesis template. This is something we use internally for people to try to write down user stories in a way that we can run A/B tests. And it requires 3 points: a theory, a validation, and an objective. I won't read it to you, but basically you fill in the blanks, and it gives you something that is easier to test. Now, Diogo flipped the entire concept on his head, and he said this whole A/B testing thing is not necessarily about trying new ideas and learning or solving user problems. Diogo is a principal developer, and so he's mostly interested in making the platform work better. And he says, well, we work on a global scale. We have customers all around the world. And I get continuously challenged on my assumptions about what our product should be in the first place. Let me give you an example. Should the currency symbol come before or after the number is a culturally defined thing. Should the price include taxes or not is a locally relevant thing. And there are many, many things about your UX that you don't necessarily have the same opinions about what is normal as many of your users have. And so the idea behind this validation step is also that you challenge your own preconceived notions about what your product should be doing. And I think what is interesting about this is that it sort of flips on its head the idea that all tests should be winners, that the only way for A/B testing to be useful is if you find a lift, right? This sort of language from a company I should probably have blanked out is problematic for me. They say 9 out of 10 tests fail, but failure is not something that I think is happening here, right? If you have a change that you're making to your product and you think it's going to add value and you learn that it doesn't, that's not failure. That's learning. This is good. This is winning, right? If you consider that failure, then I think you should reconsider what your objective is. Your objective is to learn how to make your product better for your users. And if you learn that something that you didn't work for them, then this is good. This is improvement. Now, let me give you an example of personal failure before I wrap up. When I joined Booking 6 years ago, this is approximately what our website looked like. So, not entirely, but somewhat like this. And I joined the team that was responsible for ranking hotels. So as a data scientist, I was trying to figure out in which order should we show hotels to users. And one of the places that we order hotels is on the right-hand side here. We show you a bunch of destinations, so Kyoto, Osaka, Hiroshima. And then we show you for each destination 5 hotels. And my job was to figure out which 5 and in what order. And for 6 months, we worked on different ranking algorithms, trying to figure out, depending on the context we have about the user, which hotels should we show and in which order. Now, this is a fascinating academic topic, and there's lots of literature that you can find around ranking algorithms. And so I dove right in, tried to find all these fancy little algorithms, machine learning all over the place. And what we were using was we had information on what we showed, so which hotels did we show, and we had information on what people were booking. So in the end, where do they stay? Are they happy with that stay? That's the most important information for us. And so we were using that to decide what hotels to show. And our notion or our underlying mechanism was that we thought that we show these hotels to people, then they like the hotels they see, they click on the hotels, then they land on the hotel information page, they book that hotel, and they're happy with their stay. That was our thought process behind why we're showing these. And after about 6 months, we'd been trying a lot of different things, and we'd have marginal success here and there. I read a paper that required a little bit more context about immediate interaction with the items that you're recommending. And so it required us to measure how many people are actually clicking on these hotels. Now, weirdly enough, that's not something that we had been looking at until that point, because we were only looking at what people were staying, right? It's more important to us whether people stay than whether they click, so why wouldn't we measure whether they click? And so we started measuring, for this particular algorithm, what hotels people clicked on. And guess what? No one clicks on the damn hotels. Huh? What? So for 6 months, we've been changing the order of these things, and no one's clicking on these things. So here's a slight problem. My theory of how this worked is that people clicked on the things, and then they booked them, but they're not clicking on them. So how does that work? So this is the first time that I challenged my own underlying assumption about how this thing actually worked. And it made it very easy to think about the next test that I would run. Can anyone think of the next test that I ran? thank you. I ran this test, which ironically was the easiest thing that we had tested in those 6 months. This was actually 5 minutes of development time compared to weeks and weeks of heavy machine learning for every other test that we had done before, because this is a display none on the CSS level. Right? The hotels are still there, but now they're just not shown to you, right? And guess what happened? Nothing. No one cared. Okay. Huh. So now I learned something. And so in the language that we saw before, so here, total failure. Absolute and utter failure, this test. No success. But in terms of how it shaped my thinking about how this product is being used, huge win, right? Because now I know that I can actually not have these hotels here. I cannot spend time on this. I can take all these people that were working on this, and I can make them work on something that's actually valuable to users, right? 6 months wasted. Didn't get fired, so yeah. And now, interesting thing happens so I was already done with this product by now, because like if this doesn't do anything, then we can drop it and we'll go work on something else. So I moved on to another product, and the developer that was responsible for this page said, well, now that we're not showing these hotels, we probably shouldn't even compute them in the back end. There's no need to actually hide them or even compute them if we're not going to show them in the first place. And so he removed the code that changed that. What's with the lights? He removed the code that actually computes those hotels in the back end. And then this is booking. Everything is a test. So we don't make any changes to our product without testing. And he ran that as an A/B test. Guess what? This is a landing page. And computing those hotels takes time. So if you stop computing those hotels, the website gets faster. This is a landing page. People like fast landing pages. And so we actually made some money. So not only was this thing not adding value, this thing that I've been working on for 6 months was not adding value. It was adding negative value. I was losing the company money by making the website slower. What I want you to take home from this is that you should take the biggest small step first so that you can challenge the riskiest assumptions quickly. And let me boil that down for you. Whenever you're working on a product, there are assumptions that underlie the changes that you make. And you want to challenge the lower ones first. So in this case, I was working on the top level. The order of the items can be improved. And that's the only assumption that I'm testing. But there are underlying assumptions that the order even matters, or that the feature is even important to users, and that what is on the page even matters to users. If you look at this page, perhaps users only care about the search box and everything else is irrelevant. If that's the case, then there's nothing I can do to make this page better that is not involving that box. So, this is really a story that's all about the people, but it's about the people that are using your product. If you are in A/B testing, if you are in experimentation, you have to consider the impact that the changes you make have on your users, because that's really why we're running these tests. That's all I had. Oh, someone clicked my button. Thank you.
Thank you, Lukas. That was an amazing presentation.
Thank you. I'll give that to you.
We have got a bunch of questions for you, though. So there's a lot. We won't be able to get through all of them, but obviously you're going to be here so people can talk to you afterwards. But one of the big questions was, if everyone is testing, how do you manage overlap of ideas and testing audience? What type of velocity exists in your organization with everyone testing?
So how do other companies do this? Because so this is not a function of testing, right? This is a function of organizational distribution, right? If you're not testing and you have a product and there's multiple teams that are working on the same product, how do they solve this, right? With testing, I can at least see in a shared tool that these tests are happening. I can see what the conjoined impact is of these tests. I can see whether they overlap or interact in some way. So actually testing is a solution here. It's not the problem. The problem is that there are apparently multiple teams working on the same product. So I'm not sure I understand the question. Yeah.
If everyone runs experiments, how do you ensure that the results don't skew each other? Is everything run with mutual exclusivity?
Yeah, so this is the interaction question, right? Why is it that always, like every single conference, this is the #1 question? Are people really this concerned? Yeah, okay, so here's the thing, right? Interactions are indeed a thing. So when multiple tests are run together, you can bias the results. In practice, most tests don't actually have the intended effect. And if they don't have any effect, they cannot interact. And if you look at the bigger companies that are running experiments, none of them are actually too worried about having interactions. And again, I think this is focusing on the wrong problem. My concern is more, if you put these conflicting things in production and you break the website, that would be really bad, right? Running these experiments overlapping and having biased results is actually a good thing, because then I can detect and I can avoid putting these things in actual production, right? But if you are going to solve this problem during testing, you're going to do lanes or you're going to avoid overlap, then you actually make the problem worse, because then you will only find out that there is a problem once you hit production. And then suddenly your financial department will come to you and say, hey, why did our revenue go down by 50%? And that's too late, right? It's better to detect it during testing. So I think like this question comes up every single conference, and I wonder, like, are we focusing on the right problem here? Because to me, it's more problematic if these things actually hit production.
Yeah. Let's do a quick last one here. People are asking what tool you use to create the central repository for all the tests and iterations and so on.
What tool did you use to create this? Perl. Yeah, I mean, what tool did you use? We built something from scratch, right? We started 14 years ago. There was nothing. There was no thing to build. So we used Perl and Bootstrap. That's it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, Lukas.
I'll be here all day, so if you have questions, then